On a bright morning, Captain James Holloway, a skilled and respected black pilot, touched down at a small regional airport in his private jet. James had been flying for years, building a strong reputation in the aviation industry. His company, Holloway Aviation, had provided private flights for corporate clients, celebrities, and high-profile individuals. Today's flight was a routine trip, and he was looking forward to a peaceful landing and a bit of rest. As James taxied the jet toward the hangar, he followed the usual procedures, preparing for an easy disembarkation. He was familiar with the airport and its staff, having flown in and out of the area several times before. The day seemed like any other, with a clear sky and no sign of trouble. But as soon as James stepped off the plane, something felt off. He noticed a police officer standing nearby, his gaze fixed on the plane. James didn't think much of it at first, but the officer soon approached him. The man wore a stern expression, and his body language was tense. James greeted him with a friendly smile, expecting a simple exchange. However, the officer didn't respond with a smile or even a handshake. Instead, he immediately started questioning James in a firm, almost accusatory tone. "Who are you?" the officer asked, his eyes scanning James's uniform and the jet. James, always calm and professional, introduced himself politely. "I'm Captain James Holloway, the owner and pilot of this aircraft." But instead of responding with a polite acknowledgement, the officer narrowed his eyes and raised an eyebrow. "I don't believe you," he said sharply. "You don't look like you belong here. I need to see your papers." Confused, but trying to stay calm, James explained that he owned the jet and operated a legitimate aviation company. He had all the necessary documentation with him, including his pilot's license, the aircraft's registration, and business papers for Holloway Aviation. Yet, the officer didn't seem interested in hearing him out. "You're telling me you own this plane?" The officer's voice grew louder, drawing attention from a few nearby airport workers who had stopped to watch the scene. "You don't look like you could afford something like this. I'm going to have to arrest you." James was taken aback by the officer's words. He had never encountered such blatant disrespect or questioning of his authority before. Still, he remained composed and explained again that he was the owner of the aviation company and that he had been flying professionally for years. But the officer wasn't listening. His mind was made up. Without any further discussion, he reached for his handcuffs and ordered James to step away from the jet. James, shocked by the sudden turn of events, asked why he was being treated like this. "I'm placing you under arrest for trespassing and illegal landing," the officer declared, ignoring James's attempts to explain. "You don't belong here." James couldn't believe what was happening. He had worked hard his entire life to get to where he was, building a successful company, earning respect in his field, and becoming a trusted pilot. But now, this officer was dismissing all of that without even checking the facts. As the officer started to cuff James's wrists, the pilot's mind raced. How could this be happening? He knew the rules of the airport, and he had done nothing wrong. But in that moment, none of it seemed to matter to the officer, who remained focused on his belief that James didn't belong. In that quiet moment on the tarmac, with the plane in the background and the handcuffs cold against his skin, James realized that this was more than just a mistake. It was something much deeper, something that could change everything. James couldn't believe what was happening. As the officer roughly placed the handcuffs around his wrists, he tried once more to reason with him. "Please, I'm the owner of this jet. I have all the documents right here. Just check the records, and you'll see I'm not doing anything wrong." But the officer didn't seem interested in listening. His face remained serious and determined. He ignored James's request and began pulling him toward the police car. The officer's grip on the handcuffs tightened, as if he was convinced that James was some kind of criminal. James could hardly believe what was unfolding. He had flown for years without any problems, and now he was being treated like a criminal in front of the very people who knew him as a respected pilot. As they walked toward the car, James tried to make sense of the situation. The officer had asked for his ID and papers, and James had presented everything he needed, including his business documents. Still, the officer had chosen to disregard all of it. James knew that he couldn't change the officer's mind by simply talking. The officer was already too convinced of his wrong assumptions. "Why are you doing this?" James asked, his voice calm but filled with confusion. "You don't even know who I am. I own Holloway Aviation. You've never seen me here before, but that doesn't mean I don't belong." But the officer just shook his head. "You're not fooling me," he muttered, barely looking at James. "I've got my orders. Just keep quiet." James knew that arguing would only make things worse. The more he tried to explain himself, the more the officer seemed to resist. It was as if he had already made up his mind, and no amount of reasoning would change his course. As the officer shoved James into the back of the patrol car, James could feel the weight of the moment settling in. How had things escalated so quickly? He had hoped for a simple, quick stop. But instead, he was now sitting in the back of a police car with his future uncertain. Back at the airport, other workers who had witnessed the scene began to murmur among themselves. Some of them looked confused, while others seemed uncomfortable with the way James was being treated. A few of the airport staff recognized the jet and immediately knew who James was. They'd seen him fly in and out countless times, and they knew how professional he was. But even with this knowledge, no one seemed to intervene. The officer's actions had caught everyone off guard, and now the small airport felt eerily quiet. James, still in handcuffs, looked out of the car window at the quiet tarmac. It seemed like such a simple situation, one that should have ended with a handshake, but instead, it had turned into something much bigger. James sat in the back of the patrol car, trying to stay calm. He couldn't help but think about the company he had built over the years, the countless people who had trusted him, and the reputation he had worked so hard to establish. It was all on the line now, all because one officer had made a snap judgment based on nothing more than his own prejudices. The ride to the police station felt long and surreal, each moment stretching into the next as James tried to make sense of it all. He knew he had to stay calm, but inside, a storm of thoughts and emotions was brewing. How was he going to get out of this? And who would believe his side of the story when all he had to show for it were his words? As the news of the arrest spread, it didn't take long for word to reach the aviation community. James Holloway was no stranger to the industry. He was a professional pilot with years of experience. More importantly, he was the owner of Holloway Aviation, a company known for its high standards and reliability. His reputation was solid, and the thought that he could be arrested for something as ridiculous as trespassing seemed unimaginable to those who knew him. The employees at Holloway Aviation, many of whom had worked with James for years, were the first to feel the shock of the news. They couldn't understand how such a thing could happen. Their boss was the kind of man who was always respectful, diligent, and professional. He was well liked by everyone who worked with him, and his leadership had helped the company grow. The idea that James would be arrested without reason felt wrong on so many levels. One of James's closest colleagues, Sarah, a senior operations manager at Holloway Aviation, immediately began making calls to find out what had happened. She knew James well enough to know that something wasn't right. She reached out to the airport, trying to gather details. Sarah was deeply upset by the lack of clear answers. No one at the airport seemed willing to speak up. Some employees had seen the officer approach James, but no one had stepped in to help. The silence made her uneasy. Was the officer's behavior a result of misunderstanding, or was there something more troubling behind it? Back at the office, Sarah wasn't the only one feeling concerned. Other staff members, some who had flown with James and others who worked behind the scenes in scheduling and customer service, began to voice their concerns. Many of them knew the officer was wrong for arresting James, but no one had dared to challenge the officer's authority at the airport. In truth, many were unsure how to react, not wanting to escalate the situation further. But as the day went on, and news of the incident spread beyond the airport, The frustration started to build. In the wider aviation community, the response was just as swift. Fellow pilots, airline staff, and even business partners began speaking up. Many knew James as a pioneer for diversity in an industry that had historically been less inclusive. They admired his dedication to excellence and the way he built his business from the ground up. To them, it was impossible to believe that someone like James would ever break the law or act in a way that could harm others. One of James's closest friends, Michael, who was also a pilot with years of experience, couldn't contain his disbelief. "There's no way this is happening," he said in frustration, pacing around his living room as he spoke to a reporter on the phone. "James is the most professional pilot I know. He's done nothing wrong. This is straight-up discrimination." The public's response only grew stronger with each passing hour. People began asking why James, a respected businessman and pilot, was treated with such disrespect. What was the officer's real motive? And why hadn't anyone spoken up to stop the situation before it escalated? Sarah, Michael, and other supporters of James took to social media, expressing their outrage and demanding answers. Hashtags like #JusticeForJames and #StopRacialProfiling began trending as more and more people shared their stories of witnessing racial injustice in various industries. It wasn't just about one man's wrongful arrest. It was about a larger issue that needed attention. As more people learned of the incident, a growing wave of support emerged. Fellow pilots, airport workers, and even aviation industry experts rallied behind James, calling for a full investigation into the officer's actions. Everyone agreed that this kind of discrimination had no place in a professional setting, especially in an industry that prided itself on skill, experience, and professionalism. James had earned his place among the top in the field. The idea that someone could be arrested simply because of their race was unacceptable to many who knew him and understood the true nature of his work. James, still sitting in the police station, had no idea the wave of support that was growing outside. He had been quiet and patient, waiting for the moment when he could clear his name. But he knew that this story was much bigger than just him now. It had become a symbol for something far more important, a fight against unfair treatment that needed to be addressed on a much wider scale. Back at the police station, James sat in an uncomfortable chair, his hands still cuffed, waiting for someone to take his case seriously. The longer he sat there, the more his frustration grew. His mind raced with thoughts of how things could have gone so wrong. He was a businessman, a pilot, and a leader in his field. How had he ended up here, in a cold holding room, treated like a criminal when he had done nothing wrong? Outside the station, things were starting to move quickly. Sarah, James's operations manager, had made a few phone calls to the company's lawyers, hoping to get some guidance. She knew that if they didn't act fast, James's reputation could be damaged. The arrest was already gaining media attention, and she could sense that the situation was about to blow up. As the news spread, more people began to ask questions. Why had the officer been so aggressive with James? What was the real reason behind his arrest? Sarah's phone was ringing off the hook as reporters, fellow pilots, and industry professionals wanted to know what had happened. Some asked for interviews, while others offered their support. But Sarah knew they needed to take the legal route to make sure James was released without any further harm to his business or his reputation. The lawyers, once they were brought in, began to work on the case immediately. They understood the gravity of the situation. They knew that James's arrest wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was a bigger issue. Racial profiling, unfortunately, was still an ongoing problem in many industries, and aviation was no exception. But what set this situation apart was the fact that James was a successful, well-respected pilot and business owner. He wasn't some random passenger. He was someone who had built his career on hard work and skill. The lawyers began by collecting all the facts. They asked for footage from the airport's security cameras, hoping to find evidence that the officer's actions were unjustified. They contacted witnesses, airport staff who had seen the incident unfold and who could confirm that James had done nothing wrong. Slowly but surely, they began to piece together the truth. In the meantime, James remained calm but anxious. He had always been someone who believed in taking the high road, no matter how tough things got. But this situation was different. It wasn't just about him anymore. He had worked so hard to build Holloway Aviation, and now it felt like everything was at risk. His employees were worried, his clients were concerned, and the media was starting to turn its attention on him. He knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to clear his name and prove that he was innocent. As the day wore on, the pressure on the police department to address the situation grew. News outlets began reporting the story, with many of them questioning the officer's actions. Social media exploded with outrage, and people across the country began calling for justice. James's supporters, many of whom had never met him in person, rallied behind him. They shared his story, demanding accountability for the officer's actions. The legal team worked tirelessly, and by the end of the day, they were ready to move forward. They had gathered enough evidence to show that James had been treated unfairly, and they were confident that they could get him released. The officer's actions were clearly wrong, and the legal team knew that they had a strong case. But they also knew that this wasn't just about one officer. It was about a larger issue that needed to be addressed. James was finally released from custody, but the battle was far from over. He had been wronged, and now it was time to fight for justice. His legal team had already started the process of filing a lawsuit, not just to clear James's name, but to bring attention to the systemic issues of discrimination that still existed in many parts of society. James knew that this case could be the turning point in his career, but it was also the chance to make a difference for others who had experienced similar treatment. As the days passed, the story of James's arrest continued to make waves, and the pressure on the police department began to build. James, now out on bail, was more determined than ever to clear his name, and to ensure that the officer who had wrongly arrested him faced the consequences of his actions. But despite mounting evidence that the arrest had been a mistake, the officer seemed unwilling to admit any wrongdoing. The officer, still adamant about his actions, stuck to his story. He continued to claim that he had acted in accordance with the law, and that his instincts had told him that something was wrong. His refusal to acknowledge his mistake only added fuel to the fire. While James remained calm, others around him were growing frustrated. The legal team, which had been gathering evidence from the airport's security cameras and speaking with witnesses, could see that the officer was not about to back down. James's legal team had collected clear footage showing that he had complied with all airport protocols and that there was no reason for the officer to have treated him this way. Several employees from the airport, including those who had been working that day, also provided statements that supported James's version of events. They testified that the officer's behavior was aggressive and unnecessary. Despite all of this, the officer still maintained that his actions were justified. This refusal to take responsibility frustrated James's team even more, but it also made them more determined to push forward. The public's reaction to the officer's defiance was just as strong. News outlets began to report not only on the incident itself, but also on the officer's refusal to acknowledge the mistake. Many people, including well-known figures, spoke out about the need for accountability in law enforcement. They pointed out how this situation was not just an isolated incident, but part of a larger problem of racial profiling that needed to be addressed. The more the officer resisted, the more public support James received. It wasn't just the legal team that was working hard to get justice. James's supporters, many of whom were also professionals in the aviation industry, began to rally behind him more than ever. They used social media to share their outrage, posting messages of support and calling for an investigation into the officer's history of discriminatory behavior. People from all walks of life spoke out, showing that the issue of racial bias in law enforcement was something that needed to be addressed at every level. Behind the scenes, James's lawyers were carefully building a case. They knew that in order to win, they needed to show not just that James had been wronged, but that the officer's actions were part of a larger pattern of behavior. They dug into the officer's past, hoping to find other instances where his actions had been questionable. They were determined to prove that the officer had a history of making biased decisions and that this arrest was not a mistake, but a reflection of a deeper problem. James, for his part, stayed focused. While he was hurt by what had happened, he knew that the bigger picture was more important. This was about standing up against injustice, not just for himself, but for others who had faced similar situations. His determination only grew as the story continued to unfold. He knew that his case had become a symbol for something much larger, something that could spark real change in the way people of color were treated by law enforcement. In the face of this growing pressure, the officer's superiors were beginning to take notice. They had been quiet for days, but now, with public opinion shifting in James's favor, they knew they had to act. The officer's refusal to accept responsibility was making it harder for the department to support him. The growing calls for an investigation into his actions were becoming too loud to ignore. As the pressure mounted on the police department, things began to shift in James's favor. The media continued to cover the story, but the focus was no longer just on the arrest. It was now about accountability. People were beginning to question the officer's behavior, and they weren't willing to let the issue go quietly. The community's response was stronger than anyone had anticipated, and it wasn't just about one officer's actions anymore. It had become a larger conversation about racial profiling and the need for reform. James's legal team, fueled by this growing public support, worked tirelessly to ensure that every detail of the case was presented in the best possible light. They continued gathering evidence, connecting with more witnesses who had seen the officer's behavior firsthand. It became clear that James had been treated unfairly from the moment the officer had approached him on the tarmac. The footage from the airport's security cameras was irrefutable. James had done nothing wrong. He had been respectful, followed all procedures, and presented all the necessary documentation. Yet, the officer had treated him as if he were a criminal. But even with all the evidence pointing in James's favor, the officer still refused to back down. He continued to stand by his actions, insisting that he had followed the right procedure. His defiance was frustrating to everyone involved, but it only strengthened James's resolve. The officer's refusal to admit fault highlighted the larger issue, the systemic biases that were present within law enforcement. This was more than just a personal vendetta against James. It was a reflection of a deeper problem that needed to be addressed. As the case moved forward, James found himself becoming a symbol for many people who had experienced similar treatment. His story wasn't just about a wrongful arrest. It was about standing up to injustice. It was about showing that no one, no matter their background, should have to endure unfair treatment because of the color of their skin. People across the country began to rally behind James, offering their support and sharing their own stories of discrimination. Among the supporters was a well-known civil rights advocate who saw the case as a perfect opportunity to highlight the importance of equality and fairness. The advocate spoke at rallies and used the case to call for greater accountability within law enforcement. James, who had always been a private person, found himself in the public spotlight more than ever before. But despite the attention, he remained focused on the goal, ensuring that the officer's actions didn't go unchallenged. In the midst of all this, James's colleagues and employees were unwavering in their support. They knew the truth about James. They had worked with him for years and had seen firsthand his commitment to excellence and professionalism. They continued to speak out, sharing their experiences with the media and emphasizing how unjust it was that someone of James's caliber could be treated in such a way. The officer's superiors were feeling the pressure too. They could no longer ignore the growing public outcry. There were calls for the officer to be reassigned or even disciplined. The department's reputation was on the line, and they knew that they couldn't afford to let this situation drag on without taking action. As the days passed, the higher-ups began to open up an internal investigation into the officer's conduct. It wasn't just about this one incident. It was about looking at the officer's history and examining whether there was a pattern of behavior that needed to be addressed. While this investigation was ongoing, James remained calm and patient. He knew the road ahead would be long, but he was ready for whatever came next. More than anything, he wanted to make sure that his case would bring about real change. He didn't want this to be just another story that would fade away after the media moved on. He wanted to ensure that the issue of racial profiling would be addressed, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated by the system. As the investigation progressed, James's case began to take center stage. It was becoming clear that the story was not just about one officer's actions, but about the larger issue of fairness and equality in law enforcement. And James was determined to be part of the solution. The internal investigation into the officer's conduct had officially begun, and the pressure on the police department was greater than ever. The media continued to cover the story, and the public was demanding justice. People from all over the country were watching closely, eager to see how the situation would unfold. Meanwhile, James remained patient, knowing that the truth was on his side. James's legal team had gathered strong evidence proving that his arrest was unjust. They had multiple witnesses, airport security footage, and even statements from other pilots who had never faced such treatment, despite following the same procedures. Everything pointed to the fact that James had been targeted unfairly. But now, the real question was, would the police department hold the officer accountable? As the investigation continued, new details about the officer's past began to surface. It turned out that this wasn't the first time he had been involved in a questionable arrest. There were records of multiple complaints against him from other individuals who had faced similar treatment. Some of these cases had been quietly dismissed, while others had never been properly investigated. This revelation shocked the public even further. People began to question how someone with such a history had remained on the force for so long. The officer, however, continued to deny any wrongdoing. He insisted that he had followed protocol and that he had every reason to believe James was a suspect. But his words no longer held weight. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his past record only made things worse. His superiors, who had initially tried to defend him, were now beginning to distance themselves. They knew that if they didn't take action soon, the department's reputation would suffer even more. At the same time, James's aviation company was receiving an outpouring of support. Pilots, business leaders, and even celebrities spoke out in his favor. Some of his clients, who had always admired his professionalism and dedication, publicly shared their experiences of working with him. They made it clear that James was a man of integrity and that the accusations against him were completely baseless. Meanwhile, James continued to focus on his work. He refused to let this incident define him or distract him from his goals. Instead of letting anger take over, he used this moment as an opportunity to advocate for change. He spoke about the importance of fair treatment and the need for accountability, not just in his case, but for everyone who had been wronged by the system. As the investigation neared its conclusion, rumors began to spread that the officer would face serious consequences. Some sources claimed that he could be suspended or even fired, while others suggested that legal action might be taken against him. The public awaited the final decision anxiously, hoping that justice would be served. James knew that no matter what happened next, he had already won in many ways. His story had started an important conversation. It had exposed unfair practices and had shown the world that success and professionalism should never be judged by appearance. He had stood his ground, proving that he was not just a pilot, but a leader who would not back down in the face of injustice. Now all that remained was to see how the final chapter of this battle would unfold. After weeks of waiting, the final decision regarding the officer's fate was finally made. The pressure from the public, the media, and even the department's higher-ups had become too much to ignore. The internal investigation had revealed a troubling history of misconduct and racial bias. It was clear that the officer's actions toward James were not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of behavior that needed to be addressed. The department could no longer protect him. The officer was suspended without pay while the department decided on further disciplinary actions. While this was a step toward justice, it wasn't enough to undo the harm that had been done. For James, the journey wasn't over yet. He had been wrongly arrested, his reputation had been damaged, and his company had faced unnecessary scrutiny. But now, at least the truth was out, and the officer would face the consequences for his actions. Though the legal battle wasn't over, James felt a sense of relief. He had won an important victory, not just for himself, but for others who had experienced similar treatment. His case had sparked a conversation that was long overdue about fairness, racial profiling, and accountability. More than ever, people were starting to listen, and James felt proud to have been part of that change. In the weeks that followed, James's company began to regain its footing. The support from his clients, employees, and the public had been overwhelming. His legal team was working hard to ensure that the officer's actions didn't affect his business in the long term. They filed a lawsuit for damages, seeking compensation for the harm caused to James's reputation and for the emotional distress he had endured. While no amount of money could undo what had happened, James was determined to make sure that there were consequences for the officer's actions. He also hoped that his case would serve as a reminder to others in positions of power that they were not above the law. As the case moved forward, James used his platform to continue speaking out about the need for reform. He joined discussions with activists and organizations focused on promoting equality and fairness in law enforcement. He knew that this was a fight that extended far beyond his own experience. While he had been fortunate enough to have a strong support system, not everyone had the same opportunities. It was time to make sure that everyone, regardless of their background, was treated with respect and dignity. In time, the officer who had wrongly arrested James was fired. His reputation was tarnished, and he would no longer be able to work in law enforcement. The department took steps to review its practices and improve its training, hoping to prevent similar incidents in the future. It was a small but important victory for those who had been unfairly treated. For James, the road had been long and difficult, but it had taught him valuable lessons. He had learned the importance of standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed stacked against him. He had learned that justice wasn't always immediate, but with patience and persistence, it could prevail. Most of all, he had learned that one person could make a difference. His case had brought attention to an issue that needed to be addressed, and his actions had played a role in bringing about change. James's story became an example of resilience, courage, and the power of standing up for justice. It wasn't just the end of his fight, but the beginning of a much larger movement. And for James, that was the greatest victory of all.